I stood frozen, the sound of my heart beating quite literally drowning out her words. Dangerous. The word hung in the air, a malevolent specter birthed from the lips of the woman I once trusted the most. In that moment, everything shifted. The truth twisted, distorted by her intention, crafted into a narrative that would redefine me in the eyes of everyone I knew. They didn't ask if it was true. They didn't bother. My friends, my family, my co-workers, their faces morphed from familiarity to suspicion and fear overnight. A man once known for kindness had become a cautionary tale, an unpredictable storm lurking behind polite smiles. Betrayal was sharp, cutting deep, but it morphed into something colder, a protective instinct, a survival mechanism honed by isolation. I felt dazed, confusion spiraling into a fierce resolve. Trust was nothing but ashes now, and I needed to rebuild from those ashes into something stronger, something relentless. I realized silence was underestimated, a potent weapon I could wield. Less reaction, more observation. I poured time into watching, learning just how far the lies had spread, breathing in the chaos she'd unleashed. Pain became data, and I became the researcher of my own slaughter. The world around me changed, but I didn't. I ghosted my life, fading into the background. No explanations, just a slow disappearance that let the myth take root. My absence did the talking. Their hushed discussions only strengthened her fabricated tale. I embraced stillness, for I was the predator now, silent but ever watching. I found power in the quiet, waking each day to forge a better version of myself. Hour by hour, I dismantled the shame she'd tried to prise into my heart. Revenge wasn't an explosion. It was an erosion, slow and deliberate. A tide that would pull the narrative from under her feet without her ever knowing. And as I began to piece together the anatomy of my downfall, I discovered her fingerprints everywhere. The whispers, the betrayals, the subtle favor exchanged that played into her wicked game. I didn't want them to like me again. I wanted them to see what they had done, to feel the weight of the truth without me having to voice it. In that space of calculated silence, a man once drowned in despair began to understand. I had not changed. I had simply begun to remember, and nothing is sharper than a man who finally understands the power of the quiet before the storm. The social landscape shifted overnight, carving crevices of isolation where vibrant connections once thrived. Faces that had warmed my days turned into brittle masks, their warmth replaced by the chill of distrust. I was an alien in my own life, marked by a stigma I hadn't earned. They didn't ask if it was true. They didn't bother to probe, to seek reason in the shadows of falsehood. My absence was swiftly calculated, clouds of suspicion forming in the spaces I once occupied. I became volatility on unsteady ground, something to be navigated around rather than confronted. I was no longer a friend. I had become a cautionary tale. In the silence that enveloped me, I began to find clarity. Their rejection crystallized my understanding. Silence is underestimated. It's a subtle force, a silent proclamation that speaks louder than frantic justifications ever could. They expected me to falter, to chase back the trust I'd lost. Instead, I opted for observation, taking stock of the chaos that unfurled in my wake. Without the noise of denial, I began to catalog everything. Conversations filtered through hushed tones reached my ears, their perceptions morphing my existence into something monstrous. With each painful whisper, pain became data, a collection of their fears and fantasies shaped by her words. I was the predator in the stillness, sharpening my focus, letting the weight of their misconceptions settle before me. I ghosted my life, fading into the background where shadows thickened. No more defenses, no explanations. I watched the lie bloom, its roots intertwining with the trust I once held dear. Their eagerness to believe a fabricated narrative only reinforced the strength of my resolve. I would not waste breath fighting against the tide. I would embrace it, letting the stillness reveal its truths. In this isolation, I began forging a stronger version of myself. The hours grew longer, but I found solace in the discipline of reinvention. I poured my energy into body and mind, strength in silence, focus in absence. With each passing day, my vision crystallized. Revenge wasn't an explosion of chaos. It was an erosion, calculated and precise, like the slow retreat of the tide revealing the stones beneath the waves. I studied her fingerprints, tracing the edges of every lie spoken, every whisper exchanged. A draft of her fragility. I didn't want them to like me again. I wanted them to witness their own complicity in my downfall without me uttering a single word. The truth of her betrayal would rise on its own, stark against the backdrop of their assumptions. I sank deeper into the stillness of my isolated routine, the world around me folding into shadows that I began to master. I had learned to listen, not just with my ears, but with every fiber of my being. In the silence, a new awareness emerged, allowing me to map the territories that she had redrawn with her whispers. Every stare, every hushed conversation that skirted around me, each one stored away like pieces of a shattered puzzle, waiting for me to assemble them into a coherent picture of betrayal. They hadn't asked if it was true. They had merely accepted her version of reality. The bitter truth settled into my bones. A man's character could drown in the tide of fear and perception. The narrative could turn a compassionate heart into a monster overnight. I had no choice but to become an architect of my own reclamation, constructing a narrative in the cold corners of rooms where trust no longer thrived. Preparation began with small, deliberate actions. I started reaching out, casually at first, to those who had once stood close. A smile here, a shared joke there, gathering small threads of camaraderie while remaining razor-focused on the truth I was intent on unveiling. They thought me a ghost, merely drifting through their lives, but I was more like a shadow, a quiet observer, collecting evidence of her deceit with every interaction. Pain became data, and at the same time, it molded me into something methodical. In secret, I documented my findings, stitching together a tapestry of manipulations. My phone became a vault of misinterpretations and misleading texts, snippets of conversations recorded in the dark. I collected favors owed, smiles exchanged, and the small prices paid for others' feigned loyalty as they fell victim to her lies. Each detail was a tool, a weapon I crafted in silence, each a vital piece in the slow and precise erosion I was enacting against her. I honed my physical form as much as I sharpened my mind. The gym became my sanctuary, weights lifting, muscles straining in the absence of an audience. Transformation took root in the quiet spaces I now inhabited. I became a fortress of restraint, concealed strength. This was not about an explosion of chaos. It was about endurance, building an arsenal without raising suspicion, fortifying my resolve until the time was right. Every shared laugh masked my true intentions. A seamless facade I wore while my spirit began to regenerate in the echoes of solitude. I was no longer just a spectator. I was gathering the elements necessary for my ultimate act of defiance. Revenge isn't explosion, it's erosion. A tide that pulls the sand from under the feet of those who think they're safe, and it only reveals the stones beneath when they're least prepared. The day I would illuminate the truth was not far off, and when it came, it would unfold not in shouts or accusations, but in the anguish that followed the exposure of her lies. I chose my time carefully, deliberate in the fluidity of my movements. The predator doesn't announce its presence. It waits for the opportune moment, ready to pounce when the conditions are ripe. I wanted them to see the truth, not through me, but through their own reckoning. I wanted them to confront the consequences of their complicity in her deceit. Nothing needed to be said. I was building my silence like a safe haven, patiently manufacturing a stage for her unraveling, where she would stand exposed against the world she had sought to manipulate. In my solitude, I had discovered that the quiet is a form of power, and now it was time to let it speak. I stopped explaining myself, stopped giving a damn about justifying who I was to anyone. Instead, I became a ghost, an echo fading in the warm light of their casual, distributed conversations. People I once called friends no longer lingered in my periphery, voices softening as they passed me by. The word dangerous flitted through the air like a contagion, weaving its tendrils around the unsuspecting, gripping them in paranoia and fear. I let it grow. They didn't ask if it was true. They accepted it, allowed it to flourish in their minds. I watched them squirm in discomfort, too afraid to confront the specter I had become, a phantom wearing my face but devoid of my truth. Yet, what power came from stillness, from holding my tongue and letting their frantic imaginations run wild? In the absence of noise, clarity crystallized. The foundation of their mistrust was not the truth. It was her narrative, a carefully spun tale that had become a web ensnaring us all. I recognized something essential. The predator doesn't lunge or roar. It waits, observes. I assumed the role of the silent watcher. Their words became my hunting ground, the whispers and glances sticky and thick with unexamined judgments. Bit by bit, I receded into the shadows, each day further pulling myself from their grasp. I started to see how dangerous transformed from an adjective into a brand. From afar, I could see the quiet chaos unfurling in my absence. Laughter grew more tense. Eyes brightened with drink and anxiety whenever my name slipped into conversation. I leaned back and embraced it, let the misconception do its dirty work, allowing it to amplify with each half-told story. The absence echoed louder than any protest could. With their breaths sharp around me, I mapped each reaction. I became an archivist of this betrayal, recording every shift in tone, every sidestep at my approach. Pain became data, a cold ledger of their disloyalty and deception. It lit a fire in me, an insight that every hushed voice, every fearful glance only added depth to my revenge, eroded the terrain beneath her feet slowly. In the silence, I forged a stronger version of myself, reshaping my body to match the mental fortitude I was cultivating. Day after day, under weights, I transformed. Each lift echoed a soft promise to myself. I would not break. I would not bow. Revenge isn't an explosion, it's erosion. It requires patience, relentless and certain, pulling everything into the depths before revealing the jagged stones beneath. The moment would come when the tide shifted. I could feel it. I had woven a tapestry of silence that would soon be revealed. I wanted them to see her for who she was, the architect of their fears, the artist of lies. Nothing needed to be said. The truth would expose itself, thrumming to life against the backdrop of their hastily erected assumptions. When it came, her fall wouldn't be met with screams or a furious uproar, but a whisper of realization permeating the air, subtle, insidious, devastating. I was not chasing the need for their approval, but the satisfaction of seeing them squirm, confronting the consequences of their blind complicity, and reveled in the stillness that now cloaked me like a shroud, for I had begun the countdown to her undoing. With the patience of a calculating ghost, I prepared for my moment. They were oblivious, and I was 10 steps ahead. I spent countless hours shaping a new version of myself, constructing a better war within the confines of my solitude. The gym became a sanctuary where shadows danced across mirrored walls, reflecting not just my physical transformation, but the quiet storm brewing inside me. Each rep, each drop of sweat, was a response to the intricate web of lies she had spun, a physical testament to the emotional upheaval I had endured. I wasn't merely rebuilding, I was recalibrating my entire being, focusing on strength that lay hidden beneath the surface, waiting to emerge with precision. Outside that sanctuary, I practiced calculated silence. This was my greatest weapon. It disarmed their expectations and left them grasping for explanations in a darkness I had learned to embrace. I watched how her narrative held them captive, how they clung to perceptions of dangerous as though it were a protective talisman against the truth. All around me, curious glances and sidelong whispers morphed into palpable energy, and I became attuned to this undercurrent. Vigilant, aware. Every laugh shared became a thread, woven through the tapestry of my observations. I'd smile and nod, feigning casualness as I catalogued their reactions. I was no longer merely drifting through their lives. I was actively observing, accumulating data that would one day serve a greater purpose. Each moment was a treasure trove of insight, revealing the ironies of their surrender to her crafted reality. They didn't ask if it was true. They accepted it as gospel. Time felt elastic, yet purposeful. I knew the tide was slowly shifting. The whispers carried a note of trepidation, and her grip on their minds softened with each passing day. Revenge wasn't explosion. It was erosion, a subtle undressing of the facade she wore. I watched as friends who deemed me a threat began inadvertently sowing seeds of doubt about her intentions. Innocent inquiries, seemingly harmless comments began to surface, creating fissures in her narrative. She remained unaware of the quiet infiltration taking place, her confidence a facade, one I embraced in my silence. With every stone she cast, I built walls, fortifying my resolve until the moment arrived when her careful architecture would begin to tremble under its own weight. I followed the trail of her calculated manipulations, like breadcrumbs leading me deeper into her orchestrated chaos. The realization dawned on me. I didn't seek their acceptance any longer. I craved acknowledgement of the truth, of how their blindness had contributed to this disarray. In shadows unbroken by sunlight, I crafted the environment for my revelation, allowing the tension to mount until it became almost unbearable. The predator, the silent observer, prepares. Every heartbeat echoes the certainty that chaos, like a tide, will reveal the jagged stones beneath. Patience was my ally, and as I stood firmly in this stillness, I felt control slip through her fingers like sand. The end of her reign was nigh, and around me misperceptions would soon fall like dominoes, cascading into truths no one could ignore. The stage was set, the audience blindfolded by her misdeeds. They would soon seek clarity, and as I finally pulled back the curtain on her machinations, I would let them see her for what she truly was, the architect of their fears who no longer held dominion over my story. The two-faced mirage would finally shatter under the weight of their own complicity as the echo of my silence deepened, enriching the moment of exposure that would be both unveiling and revelation. I smiled, not in triumph, but in anticipation of their awakening. What power there was in the quiet buildup of my retribution, those moments before the storm finally broke. I had spent countless hours meticulously tracing the lines of her deception, each whispered word, each calculated favor, laid bare like an intricate map of betrayal. The anatomy of my reputation dismantled was nothing short of a surgical dissection, revealing her fingerprints on every slice of deceit. Pain became data, an archive of confusion that I catalogued in silence. I found strength in the pattern, each detail honing the weapon I was crafting in the shadows. But just as I reached a moment of clarity, a complication emerged. A familiar figure from my past resurfaced. Jenna, a mutual friend, someone I hadn't seen in months, stepped into my life again, uninvited, yet asserting herself with an unexpected confidence. She didn't just arrive. She crashed through the delicate structure I had painstakingly built. Her presence was a torrent, and I felt my composure falter. The calm I had wielded like a blade was now a flickering candle poised to extinguish. A text arrived from her, casual, seemingly innocent. "I'd love to catch up. Heard some things. Let's grab coffee." My heartbeat quickened, echoing in the constricting silence of my apartment. Did she know I had kept my distance, watched from afar, reinforcing my walls with every conversation I meticulously deciphered? But here she was, pulling at threads I thought were tightly wound. They didn't ask if it was true. That sentiment cut deep now, and Jenna was a remnant of the world I had chosen to leave behind. She represented an eerie blend of nostalgia and threat, a bridge to the chaos I sought to dismantle. The journey I'd embarked on, a strange pilgrimage through betrayal, had crafted a version of me both diminished and revitalized. But what if I had miscalculated? What if this was the moment the fragile architecture of my revenge began to tremble? In the hours that followed, I reconvened with my notes, reminders of conversations, evidence of her cunning choreography, each item a stitch in my shield. My phone buzzed again. I ignored it, convinced that each ping was a potential pitfall, a distraction from my focus. I was learning to normalize the return to stillness, but the prospect of a face-to-face meeting unsettled me. I remembered her laugh, the warmth of her embrace, a stark contrast to the chill of isolation, a vengeful catalyst wrapped in familiarity. I didn't want them to like me again. I didn't seek their approval. I intended to expose them to the truth without uttering a single word. But Jenna's eagerness to engage prompted questions I hadn't equipped myself to answer. What if she attempted to bridge gaps, to draw others back together? What if her friendship fell like a guillotine above my carefully laid traps? Silence is underestimated, I reminded myself. One sharp breath before the plunge. I needed to adapt, recalibrate like a knife that has grown dull from use. I pictured it now, pulling away from the light, back into the shadows, ready to be sharpened again. My reaction would be stealthy. I considered allowing her into my plan, letting that familiar warmth become a calculated risk. With patience, I could twist this encounter into a tactical advantage, opening her eyes to the reality I had come to know. Jenna wouldn't hold the power. I would. I dropped the facade of dread and began tracing new threads. An invitation, perhaps, to coffee, but under the thin veil of shared laughter, I could intertwine my truths with hers, revealing little, allowing her confusion to fester like a wound. I watched from my window as she strolled down the street, the sun casting her in a halo, blissfully unaware of the storm circling just beneath the surface. This time, I wouldn't flinch. I would pull back the curtain just enough to let her see what lay beyond, until the veil of her loyalty grew thin. My patience sharpened, my resolve remained cold. Though doubt lingered like a shadow, I balanced it on the tightrope of my intent. I wouldn't let a single misstep unravel everything I had built. So I adjusted my course, embracing the disruption as the genesis of something else. I was a predator now, bending shadows to my will, calculating. Jenna was merely another becoming a part of my retribution, a new player on the board I had perpetually monitored. I wouldn't let her presence disrupt my focus. I would wield it. And thus, the stage whispered for balance anew, suspended in the silence of a war where each move could be my salvation or downfall. Only time would tell. I felt the fabric of my world shift when I stepped into the unfamiliar territory that was once my social landscape. Shadows stretched longer, their meanings obscured. The atmosphere buzzed with unspoken judgments that clung to the air like a heavy fog. Faces I recognized morphed into blank slates, but I knew their minds did not share the same emptiness. I had learned to observe their reactions from a distance, and with each interaction, I felt the tightrope of my control growing taut. They were wary now, like the anxious gazes of birds sensing a predator hovering nearby. They didn't ask if it was true. They had already decided, and in that choice lay the profound lesson I was beginning to master. To exist is to wield power, even in silence. Each meeting with familiar faces was a data point, and I was the researcher of their perceptions. Pain had become data, and that data flowed smoothly through my mind, shaping an exquisite plan. It was time to return to the fold, to slowly reinsert myself into the threads of their lives. I had forged a new existence in the isolation of my solitude, cutting away distractions, emerging when the moment was right. Like an artist unveiling a masterpiece, I began the delicate process of weaving myself back into their collective tapestry. No grand entrances, no fireworks, just a slow, calculated emergence. At a gathering, the familiar clinks of glasses harmonized with laughter, echoing the kind of joy I would once have been a part of. Yet, I stood on the periphery, crafted by resilience, a silhouette observing the landscape. It was then that Jenna approached, a ghost from my past, once a friend, now a specter of complications. She was a glimmer of warmth in the otherwise cold room, but that warmth generated chaos, an uncertainty that reverberated within me. She smiled, her familiarity disarming. "I'm so glad to see you." The words danced around my ears, but I did not reciprocate the warmth. I responded with a nod, a steadying breath, the pulse of my calm pulsing through the tension. Inside, my mind whirled. I needed her to think I was just another leaf blown into her orbit, but I was the storm. Her grip on the narrative had started to slip. I could feel it. The absence of my former self created ripples of curiosity and deception, full of weariness and doubt as whispers flickered among the loosely knit group. The atmosphere had subtly shifted, and I didn't wish to embellish that with emotion. No smile broke my facade. This wasn't a reunion. It was a reckoning. Jenna navigated toward me, trying to bridge the chasm with stories of what everyone else had said. But I had no interest in pulling her closer. Instead, I allowed her words to become data, gathering fragmented thoughts as I leaned back into silence. The more she spoke, the more I could gauge their hesitations. Claims of guilt from people who once labeled me dangerous now floundered like fish gasping for air. She didn't know I had already begun to sow discord in her perspective. Casual conversations had turned into probing inquiries. Whispers behind closed doors carried a new tone, forming questions she hadn't anticipated. Was it possible that the dangerous man was simply a mirror to her own fears? It fascinated me, the construction of her reality unspooling as doubt began to color the edges of her confidence. In that moment, the predator within me sharpened its focus, positioning itself strategically just out of sight. She wasn't the controlling entity she fantasized about. She was merely the centerpiece of the unreeling truth I held close to my chest. As my heart beat to the rhythm of revenge, I reminded myself that the silent observer prevailed where the loud were merely forgotten. I watched her grasp at straws, desperately trying to consolidate her impact, while I maneuvered my own narrative in shadows. Light always exposes weakness. It had exposed her in the glare of curiosity and doubt she was beginning to achingly feel. My truth was not a shout. It was an erosion, a gentle tide that would soon wash over her perception, revealing not just the littlest truths, but the vast cliffs of her deceit. This wasn't about revenge. It was about restoring equilibrium. The world would see her for what she was, the architect of their fears, and I would stand by, a mirror reflecting clarity into darkness. I didn't want them to like me again. I wanted them to feel the weight of their complicity resting heavily upon them, echoing in their memories. I was no longer a cautionary tale. I was the reckoning, a phantom woven into the fabric of their lives, waiting to be seen. As the tension simmered, I felt the power shift. The truth doesn't knock, it erodes. And tonight, my silence would speak louder than any defiant declaration. The groundwork for my return was laid down in silence, and with each beat of their uncertainty, I stood patient, sharp, and unwavering, ready for the next step. What joy there was in just being the observer, the predator waiting for the precise moment to strike. I wouldn't be just the name they whispered about. I would become the silent force of retribution from the shadows they had cultivated. And it was just the beginning. The moment had come, and the air around me felt electric with anticipation. Shadows cast by flickering overhead lights danced ominously across the room, pulsing with the tension I had cultivated. I could sense the shifting energies, the weight of unspoken fears thickening the atmosphere, and I reveled in it. I had never forgotten how quickly they had turned against me. They didn't ask if it was true. They accepted the whispers, allowing a fabricated narrative to blossom like a poison ivy vine choking the life from a sturdy oak. My plan, painstakingly crafted in silence, was about to unfurl. I had spent countless hours compiling evidence, conversations recorded, emails saved, journal entries cataloging moments punctuated by betrayal. Each piece was meticulously chosen, a sliver of truth selected to pierce through the distortion she had created. I wouldn't unleash it all at once. That would only stir chaos without purpose. No, I would be methodical, laconic in my revelations. The slow drip of the truth echoing like a metronome counting down to her exposure. As I released the first of these carefully selected truths into the murmur of the group, I noticed a shift, a subtle unease in the familiar laughter, the way conversations stuttered. She was there, sitting amongst them, her expression shifting from confidence to confusion as my words danced into their ears and wrapped around their increasingly questioning minds. Curiosity flickered in their eyes, and with it came the possibility of doubt. Doubt I had sown into their hearts without raising a single finger. The initial comments landed like ice water, chilling the warmth of misplaced trust. Her name began to emerge in new tones. Fingers pointed more uncertainly as the narrative I had orchestrated spun its threads around her. The real art of my revenge was in making her crumble not under my weight, but under the gravity of her lies. I felt not the flash of rage, but symmetry. The same confusion she had fed me was feeding her now, served cold. Those once adoring glances of worship began to sour as I methodically peeled back the layers of her deception. Each deliberate move I made was the rustle of a predator in the brush, circling closer, waiting for the right moment to strike. I observed her faltering as she attempted to anchor her footing amidst the growing tide of questions. They were beginning to see her for what she was, an architect of discontent. Each word I spoke reinforcing that image, the trap tightening around her very essence. In that cacophony of whispers and side glances, I discovered something exhilarating. The silence I had wielded so effectively was now rippling outwards, thrusting shadows into the light until they morphed into something stark and menacing. I didn't want them to like me again. I wanted them to wake up to the nightmare they had been a part of, the storm of deceit crashing against the fragile shoreline of their trust. My heart thudded steadily beneath my calm facade, a tiger lurking in the tall grass, each thump echoing the rhythm of retribution. I watched her grasp at solutions crumbling in her palms, whispered assurances falling flat as I leaned into the stillness. The predator doesn't lunge. It waits, watching, waiting for the moment she would turn her head, and I would be there, not to pounce with fury, but to allow her own fall from grace to become inevitable. They still whispered my name, only now trepidation colored it. I wore the storm like armor, ready for the strikes of thunder that echoed through our conversations. I drew strength from the chaos she had wrought, embracing the power in each revealing moment, sliding closer to the inevitable unraveling. I felt it in my bones, the contest of wills shifting toward me. The erosion of her carefully constructed reality had begun, and soon she would perceive the full scope of her miscalculations, just as I had. I was no longer the man they feared. I was the architect reclaiming the truth behind the lie, calm, collected, powerful. The storm was here, and it was time for her to face its fury. I heard it secondhand, an echo of a rumor flitting through the air like a leaf caught in a chilly wind. "She regrets a lot," someone said, the words tinged with a mixture of pity and schadenfreude. I savored the news, letting it settle in the pit of my stomach. It wasn't an apology meant for my ears, but the implications lingered like a ghost. Lingering uncertainty, perhaps a hint of remorse. But even so, I let it roll over me like water off a duck's back. She tried to reframe her actions, shifting blame to the emotional upheaval that had led her to bury my truth under her extravagant lies. It was emotional pain that got out of control. Her words dripped with insincerity, desperately bordering on the contrived elegance of remorse when, in reality, they were a thin veil over deflection. The damage, though, was meticulously documented. Her fingerprints all over the path of deceit, each slice of betrayal accompanied by dates and times, meticulously logged in the archive I had curated. But here's the critical twist. I didn't want revenge. At least not in the way most might imagine. I delivered it through contrast, through the stark reality of my newfound strength. I leaned into the silence that had become a part of me, reflecting on how the void I had created only served to magnify her actions. I had not risen in thrall or fury. Instead, I became untouchable, an impenetrable fortress adorned in quiet dignity. Day by day, I gained influence, the whispers around her only softening my resolve. My image reformed into the truth, seen through the lens of their creeping doubt. They didn't ask if it was true. They felt the tremor of betrayal in their own hearts, mirroring the discomfort she had forged in mine. I didn't need to stand before them, like a general rallying his troops. I was the observer now, watching the fallout bloom without raising my voice. Silence was the sharpest weapon, one I wielded with the precision of a surgeon, ensuring each cut bled just enough to remind them of what they had done. I had become a force of nature in the wake of her storm, crafting my return like a meticulous clock that ticks methodically toward an inevitable resolution. And as I walked amidst them, people shifted their gaze, the once adoring eyes now clouded by confusion and speculation. They felt the warp in their perception as much as I had once cloaked myself beneath her narrative. I relished the way her words wobbled, her laughter tinged with uncertainty as they began to question what they had long accepted. The roles were reversing. I had pulled back the curtain, and the house of cards she had built trembled in response. I watched, unfazed, as the disintegration of her reality became apparent. The anxiety of my name fluttering between hearts and minds like a weighty moth trapped against a light bulb, flitting wildly, repelled, yet drawn to the truth. I found solace in that stillness, clutching it like a talisman, marveling at how the roots of her deception grew fragile in the glare of their evolving understanding. In the depths of this revelation, I experienced something unexpected: relief. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I let out a breath I hadn't known I was holding. No, I wasn't sweeping away the past in explosive fury. Instead, I watched as the very fabric of her carefully crafted world began to unravel, exposed by the soft and inexorable pull of time. I had become the arbiter of my fate, resisting the gravitational pull of rage, instead holding on to the placid confidence that flourished within me. My metamorphosis was complete. I had no aspirations to reclaim their approval. What I built was something greater: the unwavering confidence of knowing she had no control over me anymore. In that moment, as I felt the weight of my silence, I knew I stood not just as a reminder of what she had done, but as a mirror reflecting the chaos that had once resonated between us. Familiar faces turned to me with a question hanging in the air, a query begging to be answered, yet they lacked the courage to voice it. I didn't need to give them my answer, nor did I intend to. They would either face the truth or remain shackled to her illusions. Either way, they would see her for what she truly was. The reckoning was not mine to orchestrate. I had merely set the stage, and as the curtain lifted, the world would not be left unchanged. Unbeknownst to her, she had become the architect of her own demise, her careful machinations dissolving in the light of scrutinizing poignancy. And somewhere deep down, I found a stillness that felt remarkably like peace. I didn't need an apology to regain what had been taken. I had already fragmented her dominion, simply by refusing to be silenced. Tonight, I wasn't just standing on the edge of the unfolding storm. I was the tempest itself, unwavering, quietly all-consuming. The truth was poised to spill forth, and I reveled in waiting for its crash. I invited it, halted with bated breath, prepared for the inevitable chaos that would soon emerge. I stood before the gathering, a silent storm brewing beneath my facade. The air was saturated with the scent of mingling bodies, laughter echoing like waves crashing against a distant shore. They were blissfully unaware, forming a horizon of ignorance where I, once defined by deception, would now masterfully unfurl the truth. A balance would tip, a system of lies uncoiling around its architect. I could feel it in the tension lacing through the room, like a taut wire ready to snap. I opened my mouth to speak, a subtle shift in the atmosphere, an infusion of gravity pulled from shadows. "You know, I heard an interesting narrative the other day," I said, my tone woven with mirth. The room fell still, their eyes darting to me, inquisitive and apprehensive. I could sense the tightening of their chests as the familiar vibrations of fear and curiosity pulsed. "She seems to think she's a victim of circumstance," I continued, observing the contours of their expressions morphing, a kaleidoscope of recognition, doubt, horror. It's rather poetic, really, how emotional pain can twist someone's perception enough to define them by their misdeeds. Silence thickened, pressing down on us like fog rolling in over a calm sea. Her name lingered in the air, an electric pulse, before it seized their throats. Conversations, once lively and free-flowing, began to stutter and falter, like a broken record caught in an eternal loop, replaying her miscalculations and manipulations. Shadows cast no longer revealed a tragic hero. They exposed the architect handing out the blueprints for her downfall. They didn't ask if it was true. They accepted the whispers she fed them, all the while painting me as the monster lurking in the dark. The calm authority in my voice resonated like a clock ticking steadily toward an inevitable conclusion. I watched their expressions ripple with newfound realizations, pieces of her carefully constructed image crackling like glass under pressure. I had become the predator, circling closer, allowing the quietness of my truths to unfurl like a calculated ambush. Each revelation was precise, shards of light breaking against her shadowed elusiveness. I unleashed just enough of the carefully selected data, exchanges, conversations, the fragility of camaraderie twisted into something unrecognizable. They looked to me with questions dripping from their lips, questions they were frightened to ask, doubt swirling like autumn leaves caught in a gust. I revealed the web she wove, noting how each thread connected back to her, tangling tighter around her exposed truths with each passing moment. I didn't need to shout. I merely needed them to see. She was no longer a sovereign of deceit, but a marionette caught in a snare of her own making. And then it happened. The moment I had anticipated, the wave crashing over the shore. I caught sight of Jenna's gaze shifting, the flicker of confusion morphing into apprehension as she grappled with the fallout of her own ignorance. She wasn't merely losing control over the narrative. She was unraveling before my eyes, unfurling into a specter that clung to doubt as if it were her lifeline. "But she regrets a lot," I echoed, imitating the whispers that had traveled through the crowd. A tinge of delight traced my lips, watching her facade crack, the beauty of her composure shattering like glass tumbling from an unsuspecting hand. Her mourning for those lies, that circumspect regret, was a performance I could not wait to dissect, to lay bare. Emotional pain can certainly twist someone's perception. My heart soared with calm satisfaction, suffused with the realization of my tactical supremacy. This wasn't chaos. It was the slow erosion of her carefully built fortress. I was neither the villain nor the rescuer. I was the mirror, reflecting her actions back to her in cold detail, a judgment rendered without force or fury. I had honed my control into something unparalleled, feeling the air shift in my favor as the gathering began to separate, watching them recoil from her arrogance as it clipped their wings. The warmth of their adoration turned to ice, my breath steady as I felt the weight of pity shift back onto her shoulders. The breadcrumbs of doubt I had strewn had led them all here, and they began to question the roots of their previous allegiance to her, shaking their heads in disbelief. Her grip slipped further, her narrative disintegrating against the wave of awakening. I absorbed their confusion, delighting in the quiet satisfaction of exposing the architect of their fears. I was a force now, untouchable, a method etched in meticulous precision. Each laugh that twisted in response felt like an acknowledgement of the truth they had chosen to neglect. Finally, as the room pulsed with the tension of the unfurling disaster, I stepped back into the shadows, the cool facade of calm wrapping around me like a cloak. They had begun asking the questions I'd anticipated all along, and I reveled in the knowledge that my silence, once a shroud, had morphed into the scalpel cutting through her carefully constructed lies. They say I changed. They're wrong. I bided my time. I remained silent while chaos echoed in my heart. I delivered this reckoning not with shouts, but with the inevitable whisper of truth spilling from the darkness, revealing each disloyal stitch that would ultimately lead her to the mirror of shame she had crafted for herself. And in the quiet aftermath, I found, for the first time, a sense of stillness, knowing that her light had begun to fade. I walked through the echoing hall, where whispers lingered like ghosts of derision. Each step was a reminder of the armor I had donned, forged in the fire of betrayal. The world had shifted beneath me, morphing from warmth into a chilling void filled with suspicion. I once stood in the center of friendships, thriving in their embrace, yet now I felt like a specter, shrouded by the veils of their assumptions. Their eyes, once filled with camaraderie, conveyed more now, judgment cloaked in pity and uncertainty. The atmosphere buzzed with a tension that felt heavy enough to choke off laughter, turning pleasant exchanges into cautious maneuvers. They didn't ask if it was true. They never had. I had become an untouchable narrative, a warning wrapped in intrigue. The dangerous man, they said, and yet they were the ones who had failed to question the very foundation of our shared reality. It was a world I had watched collapse, all while drawing strength from the stillness. Each face turned to me with trepidation, some glancing away, others lingering, haunted by their own choices. I was no longer the man they feared. I was the mirror reflecting their complicity. I saw the tremors of doubt ripple beneath their resolve, and there was power in that revelation. I had dismantled her facade without raising a voice, simply by peeling back the curtain she had draped over them all. My thoughts danced between clarity and resolve. This was never about seeking validation or acceptance from them. No, my true triumph lay in becoming untouchable. The weight of their past judgments, their casual dismissiveness, hung in the air like a dense fog. But it was my silence that seemed to pierce through it. I breathed in deeply, anchoring myself in the finality of what I had accomplished. I turned for one last glance back at the gathering, a tableau of fragile connections twitching beneath the strain of newfound awareness. Their faces etched with uncertainty marked my departure, the price for believing her lies. I wouldn't linger to hear their ephemeral thoughts about me any longer. nor would I allow the shadows of previous affection sway my newfound resolve. With every heartbeat, I felt the distance between us grow, carving a path of solitude that felt more like liberation. Out into the night, I walked along the deserted road, quiet except for the rhythmic crunch of gravel beneath my feet. Each step became a reclamation, a declaration of independence from the chaos she had wrought. I was no longer caught in the throes of emotional upheaval. I was merely a man walking away, his burden lifted, the weight of their judgment no longer, if it ever had been, mine to carry. Locked doors and fading footsteps marked this chapter's end, a transformation of loss into power, woven into the very fabric of my existence. I was not the villain of our story, but the closed book they wouldn't dare to open again. And in this silence, I discovered a profound truth. I didn't seek revenge to witness her fall. I merely witnessed the truth unfolding in the quiet. I stopped deflecting blame and began remembering the strength that lay at my core. They say I changed. They're wrong. I watched it all. I stayed silent. But trust me, nothing sharpens colder than a man who finally understands the depths of his own survival. The night air was already different, still charged but markedly devoid of the weight I once carried. It resonated with clarity. It was done. As I took the final steps down that empty road, I felt an unsettling peace wash over me, not in victory, but in closure. It was time to embrace what lay ahead without her shadow trailing me, an unshackling of a past that had sought to define me through misapprehension. And in that final echo of silence, I found the last vestiges of my power unfurling, a promise of self-possession reclaiming the narrative she thought she could craft. The dangerous man they had forgotten to fear had risen anew, not from wrath or chaos, but from the quiet strength of remembrance.